could be quite dramatic. I mean, bearing in mind the current trend in demand, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and imagine that prices would be significantly lower, could make a big difference and could have a significant impact on the sentiment in the market. Certainly raw material is tightening. RCN, there have been some trades, most notably the major purchase by TNT Group from Côte d'Ivoire, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And prices for raw material are stable. In fact, you could say prices for raw material have been rising because the price hasn't changed, but the quality has. The quality has become lower from West Africa. And in general terms, we believe that the current prices are very attractive. Buyers, really buyers everywhere, find these prices very interesting, particularly in Western markets, and generally weak holders. Businesses, individuals, farmers who are unable to handle the material. It crashed. And I suppose the catalyst for the crash in prices was the good crops in Vietnam and Cambodia. And even though those two countries account for somewhere in the region of about 14% of world production, good crops in those areas mean that the Vietnamese processors can wait. They have plenty of time, plenty of cover to keep them going while they waited to cover their short positions. So normally Vietnamese processors start the year with heavy sales of kernels to markets like the US and Europe, and they need to buy RCN. And this year they could wait. And that meant that prices in West Africa started to slip. There was a strong campaign to suppress prices. If you went to the World Cashew Convention, you'll know that. Poor information systems allowed the misinformation to fill the gaps. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, I mean that what we might call the propaganda, or the people talking their own book, people talking and presenting information that was in their own commercial interest, filled gaps because there was no other good information systems available. And despite the efforts of organizations like the African Cashew Alliance, that unfortunately remains the case. It is difficult to get enough accurate information to enough people in good time to paint a real, genuine picture of the market. The Tanzanian raw material, which was left from 2018 and 2019, finally had an impact in the early part of this year. As we've seen, imports into India were strongly up in the early part of the year, mainly based on imports from Tanzania. Indian processors like to buy Tanzanian material. It's high quality. It's ideal for processing. And when they saw the opportunity, they bought it. There was also big volumes bought by the TNT Group, who imported some of that into India. The lockdown in India during the harvest season certainly slowed Indian processors buying. The uncertainty, the question marks over demand was a big factor. And of course, we can't ignore simply the uncertainty. People were not sure what would happen. I mean, imagine for a moment what this market would have looked like if there was a major outbreak of COVID-19 in Vietnam. If Vietnam had not been able to import the 783,000 tons that it already has by the end of July this year. I mean, it is really a shocking thought. And in a way, from a cashew point of view, we talk about prices crashing, but in reality, a complete collapse of this business during 2020 was only avoided by the fact that the Vietnamese authorities managed to suppress COVID-19 in the cashew processing factories of Vietnam. And it's pretty shocking when you think of the number of people who rely on cashew nuts, the number of small farmers in African countries, in Cambodia and elsewhere, who rely on cashews for their livelihood. Let's move on to kernels. We ask the same question. What happened on kernels? Why did prices crash? And if we look at it, cashew kernels prices dropped by 19% earlier this year at a time when, one, the supply of raw material was disrupted. Two, the demand for kernels was, and still is, at record levels. Demand for cashew kernels has been going up for 20 years in a row. Demand for cashew kernels has increased. And it's accelerating. Processing capacity in Vietnam and in India was reduced. You would have thought that would have increased kernels prices. And of course, as a result of the restrictions, the management, the reformulation of factory organization, the cost of processing increased. So we had a significant number of management challenges, raw material disruption, and cost factors that you would have thought would have increased prices for kernels, but it didn't. Why? These are a few of the thoughts that I've come up with. I'm sure there are others. I'm sure there are many, many opinions on this, but here's a few thoughts. First of all, it was the initial panic. Just that simple uncertainty. Poor information in the market, and critically, the fact of contract risk. The big factor in risk is the market risk is one thing, prices up, prices down is another thing. But if your counterpart is unlikely to honor their contract, that magnifies that risk. So you start to worry about much more than just the market difference. You're talking about whether you'll be paid, whether your contracts will be shipped, whether you should continue with your business. Secondly, there was a significant misread of the cashew consumption patterns in the West. People concluded, now maybe they concluded because they wanted it to be that way, I don't know, but a lot of people concluded that consumption would crash. Of course it didn't. It went exactly the opposite way. I think that part of that was the fact that many people in the industry assumed, I think this particularly goes for processors, many people assumed that because Chinese imports were significantly interrupted during the lockdown period in China, that would happen in the rest of the world. But of course it didn't. The Chinese market lost about 4,000 tons of demand for kernels during that period. Because of the time of year, that hasn't been made up. It's still about 4,000 tons down. But if we take out those few weeks and look at the overall buying and imports for China for cashew kernels, we'd actually find that demand is up this year. But the 4,000 tons that was lost in that period won't be recovered. But the critical fact is, assuming that the markets in North America or in Europe or in Australia or in Japan would react in the same way as the Chinese market, had significant impact on the sentiment in the market. The fourth factor is that many people had short positions. Processors tend to start the season short. They have sales, they don't have purchases of raw material, and traders often have short positions. And this year, many people expected prices to fall. They'd already taken short positions at the end of last year. In other words, falling prices suited them. Why would they do anything to stop the market moving in the direction they wanted it to go? And of course they wouldn't. That's business. We look at the Tanzanian raw material again, significant raw material overhanging the market as the season started. That has been taken out, but for the first 3 months of the year, it had a significant impact on demand for raw nuts. All of these factors suited some of the stronger actors in the market. Some of the stronger processors and traders preferred that prices would fall. I'm not saying they necessarily did anything to make prices fall. I'm just saying, why would they do anything to stop it happening? Once the momentum had started, people that did it. And it's not only on traders and processors, but there's definitely evidence that there was a lot of opportunistic activity using the crisis, using the situation to delay high-priced contracts. So buyers typically, and I have evidence of this, of buyers saying to their supplier, look, I can't take that. There's a crisis on, don't you know? Meantime, going out the back and buying another container in 20, 30, 40, 50 cents lower. And there was evidence of that. That's effective life in the cashew business. Fortunately, it's something we have to live with. And finally, and I think this is not a factor to be underestimated, and this is a fundamental factor in the structure of the market and a fundamental factor in the structure of the response of the market in a crisis. And that's the lack of processing capacity in growing countries, especially West Africa. If the crisis had happened in October, we could say the same thing about East Africa. But because the raw material is 10,000 kilometers from where it's processed, because Vietnam as a processor dominates the supply of kernels, this break caused by the pandemic, this slowdown, we're in August, still there's significant volumes to be shipped. This has a major impact on kernels prices in the year. So when we look at this and we look at these 8 reasons that I've come up with, you may agree with some, you may not agree with them all, there may be others. But when we look at it, a lot of these factors are around the way we organize ourselves in this industry. Very few of these factors are about fundamentals of supply and demand. They're about sector organization, they're about the business structure, they're about market information, they're about the way the sector behaves, they're about the sentiment. And once the sentiment became negative toward kernels, as we saw, there was no stopping it. So let's take a look at the outlook. We see that the available supplies of raw cashew nuts have moved from weak holders, farmers and exporters, to strong holders, traders and processors. We see that kernels buying interest is growing some strength, and we're likely to see possibly second half of August, probably September. I'd be looking for American buyers in the second half of August and Europeans in September. Underlying demand is fundamentally strong, not only in the short term, but in the long term too. Indian demand is key. We need to look at the trends in India as the festival season develops. And all those different festivals and different markers of the year, we need to be watching the Indian market to see how it's progressing. RCN may tighten early in September, particularly in Vietnam. That's a maybe. It depends on shipments from Côte d'Ivoire, of course. It depends on processing volumes, but it's something that could happen. So I said a moment ago that one of the reasons why the market crashed was that it suited many of the stronger actors in the sector. You could actually make the opposite argument right now. You could say that the situation evolving is that higher prices start to suit some of the stronger actors in the sector. Back to our supply chain, it is fundamentally flawed. We know that. That's something that has to be managed. We're going to see the possibility of late shipments in a rising market. There's a chance of defaults on contracts. And that could be a sting in the tail of this West African season just in the next few weeks. We should bear in mind that the recessions have not hit cashew demand hard in the past. But as all salesmen of financial products will tell you, past performance is not an indication of future growth, but it probably is, and it's unlikely that a recession will hit cashew demand too hard in the immediate future. Key factors: we should look out at the situation around elections in big cashew countries: Tanzania, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Nigeria. There's a lot of elections this year. Cashews are political in some of those countries. Cashews are very important economically in Tanzania, or at least regionally in Tanzania, in Cote d'Ivoire. Difficult times. The reaction of the authorities, particularly I would say in East Africa, because we're looking to East Africa from the end of September onwards for supply. The reaction there, we've seen that the government in Tanzania is capable of, let's say, making executive decisions that can withhold supplies from the market. Could happen again or not. So it needs to be carefully watched, and that is a significant factor, the impact of elections. And in terms of demand and COVID-19, we need to keep watching the situation in India, particularly on demand, in Vietnam, on processing. Need to be very careful to watch what's happening there. And I hope that neither of those eventualities come to pass. And we should also look for the impact of a second wave in Europe. There is a spike in cases in Europe right now, right across the continent. And the possibility of a major second wave later in the year is still there. And that could have an impact. Now, we have to be careful because we wouldn't want to see that naturally. But in the first wave, the impact on demand for cashew nuts was very positive. That doesn't mean it would be the same in the second wave. So it needs to be watched carefully. So we've a lot of, as they say, there are still a lot of moving parts right now. The season is a much longer season than you'd normally expect in West Africa. And although so many of the fundamentals remain quite strong, this market doesn't necessarily always respond to fundamentals. And we need to keep an eye out too for the wild cards. Politically, what might be politically expedient during the Tanzanian season is important. What might happen as the holding of RCN moves from weak holders to strong holders, and how that impacts the sentiment in the market. There remain interesting times, and we'll continue to do so, and I hope we'll be in a position to keep you posted on that. So that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce our two guests, two African processing success stories from Cote d'Ivoire, SG Agro, represented by Alex Chulin, who's the Chief Operating Officer, who is well experienced in cashews. I've had the pleasure of working with him. He's very experienced in cashews, and they've built an outstanding factory near Yamoussoukro, Cote d'Ivoire. And Charles Kayembe from Afocanton, Benin, a company which has been around for some time, smaller than SG Agro, but persistent and survived and continues in somewhat difficult times, but still there and still going. So I'm going to ask our guests for their views on processing. And I just want to start with obviously the very topical issue. And Alex, if I could come to you first, I want to ask you about how have you managed the challenge of processing during the COVID-19 restriction?
Well, I would like to give the thanks to Jim and to ACA to invite me for the forum, and I'm very glad to know all of you. Come back to the question from Jim. I think it's a tough period for all the sectors in the industry, in general speaking. And for the cashew processing, we took the measurements to limit the risk because we had to face to the situation to continue our operations. So to take the measurements immediately is a first challenge for us to take the mask to respect the minimum distance of the workers, and to control the temperatures, the situation of health of the employees. All these measurements set up in our factories. So also from the management team, we regularly have the meeting on the situation of COVID-19 to keep them informed what was happening and what's the important measurements we should execute from the top direction till the employees. We didn't do perfectly, but I think we at least so far see the situation is stable and somehow positive. So this is from our operation side. And from the market side, I think to discuss, to keep the communication with the customer also important to keep us in a communicative way with the customers to face COVID-19 together, to understand together, and to support together. I think that this is from the marketing side. Of course, we have also some support from the governments regarding the crop. So basically, this is what we done for the COVID-19 during this period.
Okay, thank you for that. Your factory opened this year. What's the capacity of your factory?
Well, actually, we have a capacity 12,000 for one shift and 25,000 metric tons raw materials for two shifts. Actually, we are running for two shifts per day. That's remarkable. And so far, you're happy. Your equipment is installed. You're in business, and it's working well. Well, we had a delay on the installation. You know, some equipment reach our site delayed. We are also facing the installation team from Vietnam with a very serious critical period. So anyway, we get some delay, maybe 2 months regarding the launching time, but we are happy. We are glad to still run the factory this year, and with also a situation somehow stable till now. So it's a big effort from a support also from our operation team.
Congratulations on getting up and running, and I wish you the best in these difficult times. Charles, coming to you, Afacantan has been in business some time. You've been successful over the years. How did you manage this crisis? How was the crisis in Benin, and how did you manage it?
Bonjour à tous, chers amis et chers panélistes. C'est vraiment un réel plaisir pour nous de pouvoir un peu partager avec vous sur la situation de COVID-19. Comme vous l'avez remarqué, je pense que Jim a pratiquement narré toute l'histoire de cette tragédie de Covid. En fait, je pense que mon prédécesseur aussi l'a mentionné. En fait, ce que nous avons fait, nous avons seulement, premièrement, puis quand la situation a commencé, c'était une panique, oui, effectivement, comme Jim l'a mentionné, c'était une panique qui était générale. Bon, en fait, travaillant sur certaines valeurs au sein de notre entité Afacantan, nous avons vite établi à voir comment seront les contrats de 2020. Bon, puisqu'il faut se préserver sur le marché, oui, avec tous ces stress-là, oui, c'est vrai, ce n'était pas aussi facile. Nous avons cherché comme nous travaillons sur environ 5 valeurs, mais je vais partager avec vous. Il y a la valeur que nous disons intégrité. Nous devons garder notre intégrité malgré la situation est arrivée, et puis le respect de nos contrats. Comment le faire? En amont et en aval. Bon, au fait, c'était un désastre comme le prix. D'abord, les achats ont commencé timidement avec l'annonce de prix plancher par le gouvernement. Cela vraiment accentué par la crise. Donc, c'était une panique générale. Mais bon, en fait, nous voulons baisser les bras. Que faire? Les partenaires ou les financiers qui étaient aussi réticents à la situation, qui observaient mieux la situation que nous sur le terrain. Bon, en fait, on était obligé de suivre un peu le mouvement pas à pas. Mais en fait, grâce à l'appui du gouvernement, bon, ou la vulgarisation du gouvernement de la situation, comme c'est une situation qui est arrivée pour la première fois, je pense non seulement au Bénin, pour tout le monde entier. Jim l'a mentionné, Chine étant confinée, c'est une panique déjà. Bon, nous avons appliqué les mesures barrières comme les gestes barrières tels que recommandés par le gouvernement. Nous avons vraiment mis une attention très particulière sur cela, la restriction totale aussi des visiteurs, même jusqu'à présent, donc la restriction totale des visiteurs, et nous avons essayé à ce que nos agents de terrain puissent être, donc nous pouvons dire que nous les avons aussi confinés. Donc, ils sont restés sur le terrain sans pour autant aussi avoir trop accès à l'usine pour observer bien la situation. Bon, ils devaient opérer en eux-mêmes. Bon, ceux qui étaient dans la logistique aussi, isolés à eux-mêmes. Mais néanmoins, pour nos employés qui sont, je pense que quotidiennement, comme ils habitent aussi avec les autres couches de la population, bon, nous pouvons dire que nous saluons aussi le gouvernement pour avoir aussi confiné, par exemple, le sud, le confiné du nord, et cela nous a permis, comme toutes les matières premières sont pratiquement dans le nord, bon, on peut dire que de notre part, bon, la situation du point de vue approvisionnement, ça nous a arrangé dans le sens où nos amis indiens ou pakistanais ne sont pas lancés sur le marché. Ça nous a permis peut-être à vite nous approvisionner, bien que la qualité cette année n'a pas été comme les autres. C'est une qualité qui n'était pas bonne, puisque quand on voit déjà dans l'ensemble, le KOR est autour de 46 pour toute la campagne. Donc, pour avoir un KOR 47, d'abord, ce n'est pas chose facile. Donc, en fait, nous avons sensibilisé et nos coopératives. Bon, grâce à nos coopératives avec qui nous travaillons, nous les avons mobilisées, nous avons conscientisé sur la situation. Et c'est ce qui a fait que nous puissions quand même résister à ce défi. Donc ça, c'est du point de vue approvisionnement. Mais du point de vue, vous savez, le finance, comme vous le savez, la finance, c'est un peu, nous sommes tous, nous regardons aussi aux partenaires financiers, mais qui ont été très réticents déjà depuis le début. Mais bon, nous saluons quand même certains qui nous ont quand même appuyés, tels que Nat2. Nat2, c'est vraiment... elle a joué vraiment un grand rôle dans cette crise pour que la société puisse se tenir au stade où elle est.
Charles, you're hitting on some very interesting points there. I'd just like to ask Alex for his view on these. We're talking there about competitiveness. Alex, your company has invested hugely in the cashew sector. You've been involved for many years yourself. What do you think, just listening to Charles and the points he's making there, finance, supply chain management, what do you think are the factors that make an African processing business competitive in the international market?
I think the positioning of the company is mostly important. The positioning on the markets make you clearly to have a strategy in the operation, whatever of buying raw materials, whatever the processing operations, or whatever the marketing strategy. So the clearer position on the market from the company, I think, is most important first. And this strategy of the position will define all the details to make the company competitive. So if you are clear on the position, what capacity of the factory, so you have to prepare the financial support on the raw cashew nuts, which is very important in the processing factories, whatever in Africa or in Vietnam or in India. And also the position of the company of the factory to make the operation of the processing clear on the quality, on the services to the clients, and also internal training with the management team. Thirdly, regarding the marketing. So if the strategy is position of the marketing is clear, you can find in the make the clear segmentation of the clients and to clearly on the marketing step. So you can find correct customers to make them satisfied and to respect the contracts. So this is all the three sides I can share with you about to make the factory competitive.
Very interesting. It's refreshing to hear an African cashew exporter talk about marketing strategy. It's not something that we commonly hear. And it's also very refreshing and a very strong positive signal that we hear both of the processors mention the need to honor their commitments, which is essential to good business. Charles, what is your marketing strategy? I know you have an association with a Dutch group. What's your marketing strategy for cashew kernels?
Oui, effectivement, la stratégie de marketing, comme l'a dit aussi mon professeur, en fait, c'est surtout le respect des contrats. Le respect des contrats, c'est quelque chose de très, très, très important. Et aussi être en communication permanente avec le client et être à l'écoute de ce qui se passe au niveau international. Je pense que, et aussi, je peux ajouter pour cette année ou depuis l'année passée que nous avons initié l'agriculture biologique, c'est-à-dire que certifier notre usine. Je pense que la certification nous a aussi rendu compétitifs puisque nous faisons la certification bio-EU et qui est FLO, et nous avons la certification bio-suisse qui est FLO. Et en FLO, vous voyez, avec le fait trade, c'est-à-dire que nous prenons en compte de nos producteurs. Donc, c'est rassurer réellement que depuis la chaîne de valeur, depuis le producteur jusqu'au consommateur, et la répartition est vraiment équitable. Donc, tout le monde se retrouve, bon, bien entendu. Donc, je pense que c'est le grand élément que je peux ajouter à cela.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear these points coming across. Reliability, communication with customers, good market information, building a supply chain, and certification. These are all really positive factors. Alex, what kind of food safety or quality management system are you putting in place?
Actually, we are launching the HACCP as a certification on the quality control side. And further of that, we are already launching the process to get the certification of a BRC. Maybe in the beginning of the year 2021, we should have the certificate.
So BRC certification should open most buyers in the world.
Correctly.
To your business. Charles, from your point of view, have you found that the organic supply chain and organic certification has been, how difficult has that been to create and to manage?
Oui, effectivement, bon, vous savez, c'est plus un secret. Bon, avec la qualité de noix du Bénin, bon, bien que c'est vraiment une quantité qui n'est pas tellement importante quand on regarde du point de vue mondial, la qualité du noix du Bénin déjà se fait déjà compétitive. Donc, la qualité d'abord en soi, c'est déjà un premier élément très important. Et quand vous y ajustez la certification bio, je pense qu'avec toutes ces maladies ici dans le monde et autres, donc tout le monde voudra bien aller dans le bio. Et je pense que cela... Ah, OK. Il y avait un bruit derrière là. OK. Je disais que ajouter à la qualité d'abord de la noix du Bénin et puis vous y ajoutez, vous y travaillez en organique. Donc, ça ajoutait déjà un poids sur le marché international, bien que la quantité ne soit pas tellement trop considérable. Mais au fait, c'est un peu ça. Nous sommes en train de vouloir encore aller à la certification BRC, qui est normalement l'année prochaine aussi. Nous pourrons aussi être certifiés BRC, ce sera vers la fin de l'année. Mais tous les préparatifs sont déjà en cours pour arriver à cela. Mais jusque-là, on est bio et notre HCCP, la certification CCCP, et puis donc l'organique. Donc, je peux dire ça.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I'm going to hand back to our moderator now. We'd like to invite any participants to ask questions of our guests, or indeed on the market situation. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Charles, for the moment. Let's see what questions come from our participants today.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Jim, and also thanks to the other panelists, Charles and Julian, for joining and sharing with us. There are a few questions here, but mainly to do with what will happen to whatever is left unsold in Africa, whatever stock still remains on the continent. What you think will happen to it? Would it be absorbed by processors locally? And if not, how is it going to be stored and how will it impact on next season's crop? So I think here, Jim, you may touch on it, and then the others can also contribute.
Well, I think that it's happened before, first of all. It has not resulted in the past in any major significant problems or impact on price in the market. What it can do is, depending on how it's managed, it can impact the quality of what comes to market next year, because older material can be mixed in. Some countries may be in a position to manage it better than others. So a country like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, which has in place a regulatory body and has in place facilities, may well be able to manage the slow sale of the product. And we have seen the case of Tanzania from the 2018 crop. The product was well stored, the product was sold, and it went to market. And indeed, it's had a significant impact this year. It may be more difficult elsewhere where the infrastructure is of lower quality, or there isn't a professional regulatory body for the sector. And in those areas, it can just be that this product never makes it to market too. Don't get the idea that there's going to be 100,000 tons lying around, weighing on the market at the beginning of the 2021 season. That's unlikely to be the case. What will happen is, if it's there, it will be fed into the new crop. More likely is a lot of it will be lost, will be processed locally, may be processed in an artisanal fashion by small factories, I think that the impact of the slower export and lower export is much more likely to be felt in 2020 than in 2021. We're not talking about a situation as we had 20 years ago, if I go back 2001, 2002, where large volumes lay in warehouses waiting for someone to come along and prices were depressed. I don't think that's going to happen again. I'd be interested to hear what our two guests think on that fact. What would happen if there is volumes of RCN left at the end of the season?
Well,
Alex,
I think your point is quite realistic. It happened. So I think actually the processing capacity in Africa is getting stronger and stronger. We can see on your data side. So some absorption of the RCN locally will be also happen. Of course, I cannot solve the problem totally. So some RCN will be stored basically badly. This is the reality.
Yeah.
So the next year crop, the quality in general speaking will be lower as normal. So this is my point.
Thank you. Charles, I think it's very unlikely that any RCN will be left in Benin at the end of the year. It's likely to be all exported or processed. So maybe I'll go back to Ernest for the next question.
The next question is on the contracts they are preparing. The question is...
Effectivement, nous nous attendons déjà à cela. Bon, puisqu'il y a quand même un stock important dans les mains des acheteurs. Et, bon, et puis, c'est un stock qui a déjà perdu des qualités. En termes de transformation, ça aura vraiment un impact très, très, très négatif sur les produits qui sont transformés localement. Donc, bon, cela, je peux dire que nous allons seulement redoubler de vigilance dans la pratique des tri. On doit faire le tri, naturellement,
Charles,
quand on fait... Yeah.
Charles, if I could just ask you a question. Sorry to interrupt. The exports from Benin are already 115,000 tons. Processing is likely to be somewhere around 12,000 tons. There can't be much material left, at least not Benin material in Benin. There can't be much material left on farms at this point, is there?
Au stade actuel, il n'y a pas de stocks qui sont dans les champs ou dans les vergers. Donc, il n'y a pas de stocks au stade actuel. Donc, comme je disais, il y a quelques stocks dans les mains des acheteurs.
Ah, okay. Understood. Ernest.
All right. Thank you very much, Kim. The next question is about the contracts they are making. The questioner wants to find out that when they are taking these contracts for RCN deliveries, how do they cover themselves against currency fluctuations? I'm sure it's also about kernel delivery, not necessarily RCN, but then more or less, how do they cover themselves against currency fluctuations? So maybe you can ask them to explain, and then you can also support in terms of what you recommend you do to cover themselves.
Charles, how do you manage the foreign exchange, the currency risk on sales contracts?
Au fait, c'est risqué déjà maîtrisé comme vous l'avez suivi si vous avez bien suivi Jim quand il a fait l'intervention sur mon exposé. En fait, nous avons un contrat qui est déjà préétabli déjà en début de la campagne avec notre partenaire NAT2. Donc, dans un contrat préétabli, ça prend en compte toutes les fluctuations des prix pendant la campagne. Donc, c'est un contrat qu'on ne peut pas revoir pendant l'année. Donc, on ne change pas les règles pendant le jeu. Donc, déjà au début de l'année, nous nous entendons avec notre partenaire sur le prix donc, qui sera observé par tous les deux parties tout au long du processus de transformation.
Very good. So you have that risk covered right from the outset. Alex, you're part of a big group. You must have a good system for the management of currency risk.
Yeah, well, we lock the euro with currencies, local currencies, and also with our USD from our group to avoid the risks in the currency side. And also we signed forward contracts with our buyers, so the impact is limited from our side.
Okay. I think our guests have answered the question, Ernest. I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Jim. The next question is on how COVID has affected the profit margins in West Africa. And again, how does that affect the viability of creating processing in East Africa, especially Tanzania, over the coming years? So there are two parts to the question. The first part is how COVID has affected the profit margins in West Africa, and then also how it affects the viability of creating processing in East Africa, especially Tanzania.
Look, I'm going to answer that question. I'm reluctant to put our guests on the spot regarding their profitability or otherwise.
Okay, good.
It's pretty clear that COVID-19 is going to increase the cost of processing because it reduces capacity. It increases the need for management. There's the need for protection of workers, need for organization of transport to and from work, and a whole range of factors. Therefore, it is likely that it has a negative impact on processing. However, in the overall context, the trend toward the growth in processing in West Africa is quite strong at the moment. And it seems to me that although this will have an impact this year, and the major impact has been that some factories have not opened. They've decided that they're either not willing to take the risk or they're not able to manage the factory under these circumstances. Those factories that have opened have done quite well. I think we may see a short-term impact on processing, on processing margins. However, at the same time, and focusing especially on East Africa, particularly if we look at Tanzania, but also at Mozambique, what the COVID-19 crisis underlines more than anything is the advantages of processing locally. There has been disruption to the RCN supply chain, no doubt about that, and that this is where we've seen the highest level of impact in terms of the pandemic. So, as I said earlier, imagine the situation if the Vietnamese processing had been disrupted by this pandemic. Thankfully, it didn't happen, but it could have. So if we look at that, I think what this pandemic is showing is that processing locally, which is in line with just about every other trend in the market at the moment, processing locally is the right way to go for African countries in the longer term. Obviously, that's a long-term project, and obviously African countries will be supplying buyers in India and Vietnam with RCN for many years to come. Certainly, in the 2020, during COVID-19, local processing would have reduced the impact on farmers across the whole range of countries, especially in West Africa. And in East Africa, we don't know what will happen from October onwards, but if there were to be a significant impact of COVID-19, again, you would say the same thing, that local processing is a better way to manage the market in times of crisis than the supply of raw material to distant countries for processing. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. There's a question here on whether India and Vietnam will eventually buy the low quality RCN coming from especially West Africa. Will they buy?
Who knows what they will do, but history tells us that over time it will be absorbed into the market, provided it can be processed. In other words, provided it's maintained at a certain minimum standard that allows it to be processed. That's happened in the past. I have no reason to believe it won't happen in the future. But this is a strange market and these are strange times.
Very good. And then I have a last question here on what your projections are for the coming season in East Africa in terms of RC.
Wow, okay. That's a tough question. I think the indications are for pretty good crops. I think we have to recognize that in Tanzania, they're doing a pretty good job on producing cashew nuts. I mentioned earlier that there are elections. During elections, politicians don't like prices to fall, particularly for politically sensitive products like cashew nuts. And therefore, I would expect some perhaps surprising in the environment events in Tanzania. That may well mean that it may well be a boost to the local processors. I think that the season in East Africa will not be as difficult as the season has been in West Africa. I have a feeling it will not be as delayed, because if we look again back to our figures during the discussion on the market, we see that in actual fact, supply and demand are pretty tightly balanced, and that there are plenty of reasons to believe that buyers will return to the market. It has been a pretty difficult time for processors. You've got, for long periods, the cost of RCN, the raw material, hasn't matched with the price of kernels. That can't persist forever. That is likely to come back into balance. And I think, therefore, leaving the possible political changes aside in East Africa, or the impact of politics as to one side, I would feel quite positive on the season that the material will sell, that prices will recover somewhat, and that those local processors will have a better year than they did this year, and they should in particular watch the demand for broken cashew kernels as that starts to recover. And there are some signs that that is happening now. It's a long way to go on that one, but there are some signs that that's happening. So I'm naturally optimistic, and I think the worst difficulties are over in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the cashew market.
Thank you, Jim. There are some more questions here. So the next one is for the two processors. The question is, what do you think are the competitive advantages, or are your competitive advantages as African processors versus processors in Vietnam or India? So let me take it again. As African processors, what are your competitive advantages as against that of a processor in Vietnam or India? Jim, you want to preface it for them?
That's a hard question. So I'll ask Alex to start us on that.
Well, I think actually the question we should analyze in short term and in long term. In short term, I think we cannot change the situation that Vietnam and India is the central of the processing cashew. But with the COVID, also some key factors happen on the supply chain side. So with the quality of the processing in Africa, and also the services of the suppliers in Africa is getting improved, the quantity will definitely growing gradually. But how fast, how much quantity to reach or to change the situation in long term, I think is also a question on the timing side. So I think whatever we should face on the positive side on the processing in Africa and focus on our job to make it get increased, and then to improve our quality and services. I think this is what we are doing now.
But you believe that processing in Africa can be successful, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think so far I'm satisfied with the situation according to our plan. We have a plan to realize the factory on the constructions, on the processing capacity, with the techniques on the processing, and also with our customers give us the confidence. More and more demand on the contract side give us really the confidence to see what we did is correct and we are on a good way. So I think all these factors is positive for us, actually.
Thanks. Charles, Afocantan has been in business a long time. What makes you competitive?
Ce qui nous rend compétitifs, comme je l'ai mentionné, c'est premièrement notre position. La cajou la noix de cajou du Bénin, comme je l'ai dit, quand nous la comparons aux autres productions mondiales, donc vous voyez qu'elle est déjà, comme je l'ai mentionné au début, elle est déjà compétitive, et c'est ce qui fait que, en tant qu'usine de transformation, que nous puissions aussi bénéficier de cela. Mais quand cela ne tient, je voulais un peu souligner quelque chose aussi. Nous serons encore plus compétitifs les taxes. Vous savez où Alex a dit. Donc, les machines et autres, nous importons ça de l'Inde, de Vietnam. Donc, vous voyez déjà que nous sommes frappés au niveau de l'import. Donc, si le gouvernement pouvait, tous les gouvernements africains, bien sûr, assoupliraient aussi cela, je pense que ça ferait un grand pas. Ajoutons aussi la qualité d'abord de nos amendes. En tant qu'usine, la qualité de nos amendes est déjà compétitive, même au niveau des amendes que nous produisons à Afocantan. Nous avons plus des amendes blanches. Et ces amendes blanches, nous valorisons aussi pratiquement toutes les grades. Et puis, notre certification organique que nous avons initiée depuis l'année passée nous fait déjà de nous compétitifs sur le marché international. Je vous ai dit que l'année prochaine, bon, si vraiment là, Jim a mentionné de la deuxième vague de Covid, bien entendu, si elle n'est pas trop frappante, donc je pense que nous serons maintenant dans une autre certification BRC qui va encore ajouter cette compétition au niveau international. Et aussi, je voulais terminer par d'abord la position de l'usine Afocantan. L'usine Afocantan est au centre du Bénin, et donc au centre de toute la production de noix du Bénin. Donc, nous avons, du point de vue logistique, nous n'en souffrons pas tellement puisque toutes les noix sont produites pratiquement dans les alentours de l'usine. Donc, vous voyez déjà cela, cela fait que nous puissions aussi ajouter, donc éliminer les risques au niveau de margin. Donc, c'est un peu ça résumer. Et puis, nos producteurs, nous avons des producteurs qui sont directement, qui considèrent cette usine comme étant leur maison. Donc, même quand il y a flambée ou perturbation de prix, bon, ils connaissent déjà ce qui se passe au niveau interne. Donc, ils considèrent Afocantan comme leur maison. Donc, cela fait déjà de nous compétitifs. Donc, nous ne dépendons pas tellement de commerçants, nous dépendons de nos producteurs que nous soutenons depuis la base. Et donc, c'est un peu ça que je peux souligner.
Thank you, Charles. I think it's very interesting to hear our two processors effectively talking about good management, talking about managing a supply chain, and talking about marketing. These are the key factors which will make processing successful, to my mind. As we know, with the advent of mechanized or semi-mechanized processing, the challenge changed a little bit in West Africa. And it's good to hear two companies that are doing that job so well. Have we any further questions, Ernest?
Yes, there is a question here. What can be done realistically in the short term to empower local processors to process more, to at least reduce the amount of RCN likely to go to waste? So it's more what are the framework conditions that are needed to, in the short term, increase local processing. And you can also take that together with another question that talks about what are governments doing, in the respective countries to support them in these times.
Well, I think that obviously these two are linked together, these two questions. Some governments have been more active than others. The Ivorian government has been quite proactive in their reaction in attempting to support the farm gate price and in attempting in some ways to assist processors. In Guinea-Bissau, we see the government put in access to finance mechanisms, supported, I think, by the World Bank or the IFC, and that too was an important factor. Elsewhere, the reaction has been patchy, let's say. Some have been more reactive than others. I think that it is obviously very difficult because the priorities around managing the pandemic are there, and it's difficult to look after every sector, and this is why we get different reactions in different countries. As a general rule, I would say that in countries where we have regulatory bodies for the cashew sector, we've seen a much more focused reaction than in countries where those regulatory bodies do not exist. What can be done in the short term? It would be a good idea if processors were encouraged to maximize their processing this year. If that means that they need to be assisted in either funding or sourcing certain raw material which otherwise would not be used, I think that could be done. That is probably an initiative of the state. It does mean not only processing, it means that the raw material in the first place should be properly handled and managed. It's very difficult. I remember doing toll processing some years ago. Management and economics of toll processing is very difficult. So probably better to perhaps finance the processors to do the job and allow them to market the product themselves in a transaction type arrangement rather than in any kind of a toll processing arrangement. But at the same time, I don't think that the reaction is required until such time as there's evidence that this is a problem, or perhaps that it's not a problem. But it would be, I would be ideal if all of the product was processed this year, but I also think that the volume that remains is not so significant that it will weigh heavily on the market. Of course, the priority should be that the farmers who grow the product should have some way to sell it. And if that requires some form of state intervention to perhaps buy it and hold it, I think that would be a good idea.
Hello, Jim. And from their respective countries, what has their government been doing to support in these times? Hello, Jim.
Yeah, so perhaps Alex, what is the government doing in Cote d'Ivoire to support you or to support processors generally?
Well, I think we follow up the program from the government, BPCA. I think it's a very constructive program as a processors to give us a lot of guidelines, to give us a lot of support on the marketing informations, and also to give us the chance to exchange with the internal processors in the country. Of course, government also did some support on the financial support, some follow-up also for some training. So I think I'm happy to have all these supports from government side.
Sure. In Benin, I mentioned during the presentation, Charles, that the government's considering introducing a regulatory environment and a regulatory body. Are you currently getting any support from the government for your business, either related to the pandemic or generally?
Pour cette pandémie, bon, en fait, comme c'est une situation qui était brusque, je peux dire que mais le gouvernement nous a appuyés néanmoins dans la vulgarisation de gestes barrières. Il a joué tellement un grand rôle. Imaginez avec une usine de transformation d'acajou, vous connaissez ce qui s'est fait et encore nous sommes toujours nous dépendons des manuels. Nous avons plus de la main-d'œuvre, c'est-à-dire que plus de manuels que de machines, c'est-à-dire nous avons encore un décortiquage qui est manuel. Donc, vous savez, avec la sensibilisation, vulgarisation du gouvernement, qu'il nous a vraiment aidé par différents moyens de vulgarisation et aussi que nous avons mis en place au sein de l'entreprise. Donc, observer ça déjà depuis l'entrée. Donc, je peux dire que bien mentionné cela.
Good. It sounds at least that both governments have made efforts. Ernest, what's the next question?
I think there are no further questions. Maybe you can take your final words and then we'll bring your session to a close. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think that what I would say, first of all, is thank you very much to Charles and to Alex Julien for their openness. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is very constructive and very helpful and encouraging to other people. I think the message that's coming across is that cashew processing can have significant benefits in West Africa or in East Africa. And there are benefits in all kinds of ways, economically, environmentally. I think that in particular, we should bear in mind that there is a growing concern amongst consumers for the environment and for social and labor practices in factories, and that needs to be taken into account. I know that both of our guests today, and I'd encourage you to visit their websites. And if you're a buyer of kernels, go there and talk to them about buying kernels. If you are a processor, go there and you'll find some good encouragement on what they've achieved so far. Both companies are conscious of their social responsibilities, and the labor practices in the factories in both cases are good, and that is a growing concern amongst consumers and should not be underestimated by anyone. When I see one of the things we decided to do during these webinars, and we're now on webinar number 7. One of the things we decided to do was to try to underline success stories, and we had 2 weeks ago, and we've 2 more today. Far too often, when we talk about the African cashew sector and about processing in Africa, do we get dialogues about constraints, how difficult it is, how impossible it is, how much there's a shortage of money. It's very encouraging to talk to people who are able to make it work. And I think that the sector as a whole in East Africa and in West Africa can take encouragement from their success and appreciate their willingness to talk about that success. So thank you both very much indeed. And from my side, thank you all very much indeed for joining us again. I look forward to talking to you during the African Cashew Alliance conference in September. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks also to the other panelists, Charles and Shulin, and for the great work you are doing on the continent, processing cashews, creating employment, providing incomes, and getting the landscape to grow over the years. So as Jim said, we will be having our annual conference online from the 9th to 11th of September 2020. I've already mentioned there will be an opening and the discussion on policy and sector organization in the first day. And then the second day, we will be looking at processing, production on the third day, and then the closing will also follow. The following weeks in September, as I said, September, the month of September is the cashew month. So we will do deep dives into other topics, cashew, women in cashew. We also be looking at topics such as market information systems and the rest. So you are welcome to join us in September and to get into the topic of cashew and to get deeper and deeper understanding of the sector. So we have been reaching you or coming your way from Zoom, YouTube, also from the African Cashew Alliance website, Facebook Live, and then the recent addition, Microsoft Teams. And so we come back to you again on the 9th of September 2020. Thanks for being with us, and please continue networking in the background as we leave the platform on for a couple of minutes. Thank you so much. Thanks to Jim and the rest again, and bye-bye.